My name's Kwende Kefentse. I'm talking to you all from Ottawa, the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and also the capital of Canada. Yeah, I'm happy to be here with a couple of my colleagues, people who I've been working with for quite some time in this space around music and cities, Michael Bracy and Don Pitts. And I'm just going to briefly introduce myself, and then I'll let the two of you introduce yourselves, and then we will jump into sort of what we've been hearing in the contemporary conversation around recovery. And part of why we're talking about this is because we've been hosting a series of conversations about this. So just a bit about myself. I grew up in the Greater Toronto area. As a musician and DJ, I'm still an active musician and DJ. I moved to Ottawa, went to school there, and did a bunch of work focused on the relationship between the emergence of culture and space. And sort of the sort of like the spatial relationship that culture has to the way that culture emerges. After that, I did some work as a music journalist and then researcher with the Martin Prosperity Institute, and then eventually got a job actually working for the city as a cultural developer and researcher, which is what I still do. Developed a whole bunch of work around music and the music economy in my city, and then helped to develop the Music Industry Coalition and eventually the music strategy. So I do that work here in Canada. I did a bunch of research actually at UCL, following that at the architecture school there, and then continued the work around the spatial substrates of the music industry and continue to do that kind of research. And that's sort of where I intersected with Mr. Bracy.
Is that my cue to say hi?
That's you.
Awesome. So first off, huge thanks and congratulations to Gigi and Storm, and that last conversation was spectacular. And Matthew, thank you for the kind words. We're really excited to join everybody today, and it's this brave new world of 25-hour virtual conferences is something that we're excited to kind of see how this goes, and it's a remarkable lineup. So for those who don't know me, I'm Michael Bracy. I've been really fortunate to work at the intersection of music and public policy for over 20 years. I'm based just outside of Washington, D.C. And a lot of the work that I do and that we're going to talk about in the next half hour is really kind of rooted in trying to look at the structures of the music community and where music fits into sort of economics and culture and society. And what do we collectively have control over, especially in the United States? We'll talk more about this later, but part of the work that we've been doing for the last bunch of years, I started my music policy career as a co-founder of the Future Music Coalition, and did a lot of work sort of looking at the federal government here in the United States and sort of how America, the US, is sort of an anomaly in terms of how our country thinks about music and the role of policy and philanthropy in music. And so I spent 15 years looking at the structural stuff from a federal standpoint, and I'm very proud of the work that Future Music Coalition continues to do. But in the last couple of years, we've really been thinking about where are there international conversations that we can bring to the United States to help really think about cities and localities and how localities think about music and, again, what they have control over. And, for me, beyond getting to meet, amazing people like Kwende and Amy Terrell and everybody involved in our collaborative work, and I work with Music Policy Forum, it's just been such a challenge, that's a Freudian slip. It's been such an honor and a privilege to get to know Don Pitts. And so Don, why don't you talk a little bit about who you are and the work that you do and where you're from and that good stuff.
Live from Austin, Texas. I'll do a more brief version of where I'm at. I started in venue management, artist management. I spent 16 years at Gibson Guitars running their artist relations division. And I spent about 7 to 8 long years in city government running the music office here in Austin, Texas, where I had the good fortune to our work convening other cities and kind of sharing best practices led me to Amy Terrell and a whole slew of others, Kate Becker, and then led me to Michael Bracy. So I think it was our Fort Collins friends that introduced us. So hats off to them. So yeah, we're here to talk about challenges.
Yeah, and I think everybody's been hearing about different challenges where they're at. I mean, here in Canada, we have I think it's a different scale, both with respect to COVID. I mean, everybody is locked down, but I just mean in terms of the damage that's happening, just the raw numbers are different. And then obviously we're a country that's about 10 times smaller than the US. And so our networks maybe that's part of why our networks have been able to be as agile as they have. And we have some different structures in place as far as having a national funding organization that supports the music industry in partnership with the federal government, and a range of other organizations that circumambulate that funding agency that help to organize the industry such that there can be collaborative responses. So for those who don't know, in Canada, the industry has, in some ways already organized and responded. Am I totally dark here? Okay.
There you go.
The industry has already organized in some ways and responded to the federal government through doing some survey work and collecting data. And at the same time, at the municipal level, because we all know that many cities are going to need help get digging out of this. And that's no matter whether it's in Canada or the US, because everybody has spent more money on public health than they expected. There's also an effort between all the big cities in Canada, of which Ottawa is one of them, to get together and figure out how the way that they're going to be approaching the federal government across a range of areas, including culture. And so that's sort of what's been happening here. But from the calls that we've been doing with MPF, we've been hearing a different story in the US. And so, yeah, maybe Michael, you could start with that because yeah, I mean, there's the story and then there's what you guys have been doing about it in terms of trying to work to get some of that data collection that has been happening here in Canada.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kwende. I mean, I think we could spend 25 hours talking about the structural failures of the music economy as it exists in the United States, and we're not going to do that, and that's what we've been asked to do. But, in short, music workers, both musicians and performers and crew and everybody who works in the chain has been extraordinarily vulnerable forever. And that's why we do the work that we do to begin with. And, what's happening, obviously, with the crisis is exacerbating bigger structural economic challenges for all American workers, and music being sort of one segment of a broader sort of challenge. And again, we can unpack that later if we want to, but, we've been, for years sort of looking at sort of how do we strengthen these collaborative networks to really help people think about and embrace the concept of music communities being these interdependent ecosystems with music and musicians in the middle, but really depended on the sort of interconnection of public policy, what's happening with other related businesses, what's happening with research and data, and so we can understand our music ecosystems, where philanthropy fits in, and how all those sort of factors interconnect. And again, in the United States, we see some examples of cities that do this extraordinarily well and have either intuited it or they've just sort of intentionally been trying to help support and build these systems. Many other cities, really struggling to kind of get their head around what does this mean, and looking at it through either a creative economy lens or looking at it through an industry advocacy lens. So again, the crisis comes at this real tipping point in this conversation in America to begin with, because it's a new conversation that different organizations or communities are thinking about differently. But what we've been doing through Music Policy Forum and Music Cities Together is trying to kind of simplify it into three sort of interconnected but distinct challenges. The first being, again, an absolutely overwhelming public health crisis that, for better or for worse, our co-founder and board member, Kate Becker in King County in the Seattle region, that was the first place where this really blew up in the United States. And so Kate, as sort of the linchpin of King County's creative sector, has had to be, sort of the to use an American cliche, the Paul Revere kind of, sounding the alarm for the rest of the country about the reality of what COVID meant. And so part of our work has been saying, look, this is the reality of what this is going to mean for live entertainment and for mass gatherings. The second piece, again, has been that sort of interregnum of like, what does relief look like? What is the reality? How do you connect people to unemployment? How do you basically get resources into a sector that, again, is extraordinarily economically vulnerable to begin with? And how do you create, sort of data around that and understanding what is the crisis, and how do you help support traffic copying between, again, individuals that need support, institutions and businesses that need support, and where that support lies, while not trying to reinvent the wheel, because there are a lot of resources already out there. Some were discussed in the last conversation. And then the third is, again, this is why we do this work, because we knew that the existing structures did not meet the needs of the challenges of the music community. And there's a fundamental disconnect between the power and the importance of music and how that is reflected in economic structures, in this country. And again, globally, I think that's a global piece. And so what we've been trying to do through Kwende mentioned, we're doing a Friday conversation that Gigi Johnson was incredibly helpful in getting that started, but we do a Friday afternoon program. We're trying to do our newsletter. We do a bazillion Zoom calls, but basically saying, okay, what do we have any sort of control over in terms of our contribution and network, supporting networks, supporting thought leadership, supporting, promoting best practices, et cetera. And then trying to sort of, incrementally move that along with the understanding, again, that, when you take, and again, I don't think music is exclusive. We're talking about music in this conversation. So when you take a sector, again, that is so extraordinarily, I think to some of the conversations and some of the points in the last conversation, that not only is extraordinarily vulnerable, but also is counted on to be the, sort of the voice of humanity and the source of catharsis and empathy, is really asking a lot of any sector, but certainly asking a lot of the music community, kind of across the board. But Don, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the research tools that we've been trying to build, and what you're hearing and what we're collectively hearing from music workers and from people in the sector, and some of what the challenges are that we're finding.
Yeah, I think it's important to make that connection between sort of the importance of what Michael said in terms of, why we're building these networks and why it's important to have these networks together. And then also this piece about research and how to really sort of operationalize that network to turn it into more than the sum of its nodes.
Yep.
So yeah, quickly, I think one of the old challenges we had was that this sector, the music sector, was probably one of the most siloed and fragmented sectors that we've, in every city we've been in, it's just extremely siloed and fragmented. These people are in the 11 or 12 big occupational groups that have a dozen other subsectors weren't just coalescing. And a lot of times we're finding out through research that they're the same people working multiple jobs. I think from the work that we've been doing with Michael and NPF, is really twofold. One of the challenges that we have is that we don't know what we don't know. And I think time's the biggest. If this thing goes on for 2 months, 3 months, or 4 months, the reality looks a lot different. And that was the kind of the impetus of the survey, is that we're making some decisions or trying to make temporary policy, answering policy questions or giving policy answers on a landscape that we don't really know, other than the fact that it's a poop show. We know that, but I think some of the insight that we're getting from the survey that we have out right now I think it's going to help us tell the story. Well, I know it's going to help us tell the story. So there's some from a confidence standpoint, we asked the question, how confident are you that you'll receive funding from the government or charities to make up the lost income? Pick all that apply. It's extremely, was 2%. They were extremely confident. Very confident was 8%, but somewhat was 50%, and not at all was 40%. Which is when you hear the other end of the question is, do you intend to apply for assistance funds in the next several months? If so, what kind of support do you anticipate pursuing? Check all that apply. And the top choices were federal funding, 70%, assistance from local and state government, 60%, assistance from local foundations, philanthropy, 43%, and assistance from regional or national philanthropy, 43%, and then direct funding from fans was 35%. But it's like you parallel those two things that they're planning on. Most of the people are planning on applying for relief funding, but they're not very confident they're going to get it.
Yeah. And just to build on that, Don, and just a piece of clarification. So the survey Don is referring to is available at the musiccitiestogether.com website. And basically, this is a survey that is basically grown out of methodologies that Don and others have been deploying in cities across the United States since Don commissioned the first American version of a Music City census back in 2015. So as a field, we feel like we are getting collectively, not our organization, collectively as a community, we're getting better in terms of how do you gather data, how do you ask the right questions. And moving into 2020, one of our major priorities had been through Music Cities Together, which we were going to launch at South by this year. The idea, one of the major priorities is how do we democratize data? And how do we basically make access to survey methodologies and data gathering not only more effective because we're getting better at it the more muscle memory we get, but also make it more accessible and affordable, because one of the constants that we see across cities that are trying to engage in Music Cities work is their resources are extremely limited. And so any way that they can save on expenses and save on costs on the front end is going to create more opportunities to invest in implementation and sort of making strategies work on the back end. So what we decided to do after consultation with colleagues at National Endowment for the Arts and other arts partner organizations was basically take the underlying methodology of these local music censuses and make it available as a free tool that cities or local organizations, if they were looking to put something in the field to capture what's happening locally, they could just adapt. They could either take it and just put their logo on it, or they could at least see the methodology and use it to adapt it for their own local purposes. So that tool has been available for about 2 weeks. Is that right, Don? Feels like
about 2 weeks. And I think we're learning different challenges of a national survey. The cities that we're in now, we're actually spending a lot of time coaching the local boots on the ground, what to do. And so I think the model that Michael and I have been working on for some time, which was kind of the impetus of Music Cities Together, was how do we democratize it with just enough outside input and influence, or our assistance in these endeavors in these local markets. I think we've been studying the psychology of the survey takers. We've got about 20,000 respondents over the last 2 years participated in the music censuses in the cities we've been in. We've been back for 6 months researching the psychology on how they answer something, where they get upset and frustrated and mad at us in the survey point, interviewing stakeholders. So when Michael and I had called to ask about the survey several weeks ago, it was really difficult to come up with a 5-minute survey. And I think it took us about a week to really, it's a lot easier to create a 15-minute survey, but a 5-minute survey is about all the time these respondents have. So,
yeah. And I mean, and I just wanted to bring up as well, relative to what you guys are saying, and sort of some of the opportunity that's embedded in this crisis in terms of, new opportunities to leverage different models of governance. This is something that's happening here in Canada as well. Like before this conference started, I got out of a meeting where we were discussing some projection modeling that we were doing based on some feedback that we gathered at the municipal level from a range of different cultural organizations. And, these models that we developed, are going to deepen, because as we were able to get all the different organizations together to share survey data and share and coordinate survey data, they're recognizing the value now of actually being together and thinking collaboratively and collectively about this recovery, and then sort of what goes on beyond that. And, it's an opportunity for us as well as an organization to start digging for deeper stats and deeper data that can help us, know more, learn more about the sector and actually advocate better for it. Because that kind of data is what we're going to be actually using as a the municipality and the community are going to be using the same data to be able to advocate to the federal level and the state or provincial level for resources on the recovery side of this.
Yeah. The just to build on that, both of your points. I mean, I think, and again, going back to the theme of our session around challenges, and again, recognizing that we have a lot of folks who aren't in the United States in the session today. I mean, I think it's important to, talk a little bit about the other sort of structural challenge. Again, is that, my hometown, Washington, D.C., and the policy apparatus has really, in the last 20 years, been completely overwhelmed by corporate interests in terms of their control of the levers of power and who gets money and how money is allocated. And, we still, are really dealing with, this is sort of the ghosts of Mapplethorpe in terms of our fear as from a policy standpoint of government money going directly towards the arts. And so a lot of our funding streams that do go to the arts, which are very important, very helpful, and much appreciated, but they are sort of microscopic in terms of the broader scale of federal funding. And so part of the challenge that we face right now is that we're in this completely uncertain time with how our federal government is going to put resources into the economy to try to keep things afloat. And by way of illustration, when we had the economic collapse in 2008, in early 2009, when President Obama came in, the Recovery Act was at a scale of roughly $700 billion. And a lot of people were both shocked by the scale of that investment, and they also felt like that was nowhere near enough money. And arts, frankly, did not benefit from that investment back in 2009 in any significant way. It did sort of tangentially through some programs, but really didn't get a lot of direct support. So now we're in a situation where we've already had one $2.2 trillion package go through Congress. We have another one that's being finalized as we speak, which is going to be another, I don't know what the final numbers are going to be, but about $550 billion. We anticipate that probably around June 1st, you're going to see another multi-trillion-dollar package. And again, we don't really have the mindset for music to be understanding what could that mean for us, with the understanding that those resources are going to be spent. When they appropriate that money will be spent. And so again, when we think about the fragility of we think about the challenges of local media. Local music media is extraordinarily vulnerable. Public radio is extraordinarily vulnerable. I mean,
I think like, again,
well, just to finish, Kwende, I mean, the one success story that we've seen this week was the incredibly exciting news, coming out of the emergence of the National Independent Venue Association, who sent a letter to Congress yesterday on behalf of roughly 800 independent music venues across the country, making a very specific and a very well-reasoned claim to needing very targeted support to make sure that venues, when we are ready to reopen, that they literally are still in existence. And so we have some good examples of how, again, the crisis is forcing us to organize and engage in some of the processes that unfortunately music has not been engaging in, over the last couple of decades as much as they need to. Sorry,
I was just going to make the point that, and I think that it points to the value of having these networks, because it's really sort of the establishment of these networks and sort of like the nimbleness and agility of them that enables you to be able to make that ask. I'll post another link in the chat too, because there was also recently in Canada a $500 million national fund, which seems like peanuts to Americans, but it's a lot in Canada. And it was specifically for the arts, and music was specifically, named as the music industry and music businesses were specifically named as beneficiaries of that fund. And that was totally, again, as a result of organization that was happening at the municipal, provincial, and national levels, and people being able to make that advocacy that facilitated that. And we're thankful that people like Amy Terrell, who was part of our network, or who still is part of our network, is sort of was one of the leaders in the music space, and continues to have a lot of knowledge, which she lucky for us, shares with us in Music Policy Forum. And we work to continue that work forward, not just in the U.S. and because things aren't all good in Canada, there are still challenges all over the place, and we work together to try and develop solutions across the border and all over, really.
Yep. So,
do we have any questions or anything? Should we check for that? We have like
at present in the Q&A. There's, if anyone was to add anything, I was going to just give a program note that we were about to take a 15-minute break, and instead the next session, which was going to be a 15-minute provocation in 15 minutes, instead for program note, our next session will be session 5 at 2:45 Pacific. And I've put in the chat bar the time zone converter for those of you who are trying to figure out when the heck that is. But if you guys want to answer some questions for a bit, if there are any, that is great. There's also in the chat, we have a comment to see what our support, information on recovery support for the arts in comparison to Europe and what's happening with Germany. And just also a program note, we'll be talking about a lot of that, but during when some of you might be asleep. So we are recording these sessions. So any comments on that from you guys? Oh, and there's also another question. How do we reach out to the solo musician at home, out of work, who has little or spotty connections to larger organizations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge, I think. I mean, again, I think that is a network challenge in some ways, because again, even if they don't have connection to formal organizations, there have to be, or the local music networks have to be able to penetrate, beyond the level of the organization. And I think that that's going to be one of the challenges going forward. And and that's the challenge of some of these surveys as well, is actually getting beyond the level of the organization to the individual musician. I don't think there are easy answers to that.
Well, and I think part of the dynamic, I mean, Don, I'd like to hear your take on it. And again, I want to be very clear, this may be a myopic US sort of framework on this. So I'm really curious on the global take. But I mean, I think, part of what we've seen with the transition from an analog to a digital industry over the last 20 years is sort of a dynamic where it used to be that, and again, this is a gross generalization, and I try not to do that because the music community is so incredibly diverse in terms of ambition and where they fit. But, I used to think that a lot of, people who are professional musicians who had ambitions to be a professional musician would then need to supplement with a day job because, again, our healthcare situation is a disaster, or you have economic challenges. So, the self-identification is, I want to make it as a musician. I want my band to make it, but I'm going to subsidize that through the bar gigs and other things that I do. And I think part of what the democratization of music creation and music distribution has done is it's really increased the opportunity for a lot of people who would self-identify as, I'm a professor, I'm this, I have a job, that's sort of my vocation, and I make music on the side, and that's important to me. And it's not just being a hobbyist, it's being a part of the music economy and part of musical culture, but it's not kind of what they do. And then where do all those folks, like, how do we think about them in terms of data gathering and where they fit into the economy? Again, predating the the shutdown, that's been a lot of the thinking that we've been doing, Kwende, in terms of your research, in terms of the work that Michael Siemens doing, in terms of, really trying to think about how do we not look at music, surveying and understanding music scene solely in terms of professionalism, but in terms of the richer sort of interconnected networks of people who, are music.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of stuff that's not fitting in a Knox code or a NAICS code, and you're going to have to try and find some sort of proxy for understanding the way that people engage with music and the impact of music on communities. For me, I look at it spatially, but for other people, look at it different ways. But yeah, ultimately, the idea of bringing all of these things together and keeping the people who are thinking about these things together through, the conversations that we're hosting with MPF, through events like this, that's really the point.
Right.
So to get back to the question, I think there is no easy answer. How do you reach musicians that is out of work and at home by themselves, that's not connected? I will say that when we go to a city, when we talk about, our philosophy of a community-driven approach to creating a strategy, you have to involve multiple organizations. We talked about earlier about the silo and fragmentation, and then that's a perfect example of there are many definitions of musicians and different variations of musicians, and they all work multiple jobs. We found that a majority of them work 2 jobs, and silent, 30% work 3 jobs. But I think to try to answer the question, I think it just takes a lot of different organizations. Surprisingly, organizations. I mean, in some cities it's church groups. In some cities it's Rotary clubs. It can be anything. And I think that's where we kind of require our local partners to just get a very good mix of organizations as partners that are in and outside of music and the creative world. So that's my failed attempt to answer that question directly.
And we have 2 other questions in the bucket here, and we are moving a lot of the quotes, etc., and links into the Slack channel. And so we've asked our speakers how they'd like to be contacted, and all 3 of them have given email addresses. Some people might want you to go to their websites too, which have been shared. We have 2 questions, and then we'll wrap up this phase, meeting everybody back in this digital space at 15 till the next hour as I look at the clock. One is, tons of creatives are independent, self-employed, not part of any organization other than their old businesses. How do they fit into the recovery efforts? And this is kind of an emergent structure question as to representation of independent creatives.
Yeah, and I mean, again, this is something where, at least in the work that we're doing in terms of the projection modeling, we're really trying to think about this as an opportunity to really reach out to these people, because this is one of the few points in time where they may understand why it's really important for them to be part of an organization or to organize along with other members of their community, share their data so that they can be counted and numbered in terms of the way that we're trying to project what, asking for what we need. And so, I mean, some of it is just boots to the ground. I mean, I guess that's a bad analogy in this period of time, but marketing in as much as that's possible. And, using media networks and other channels locally that reach people, in a way that's maybe a bit deeper than mass media networks. And, finding a way to communicate that, this is the time where you need to actually join up in some way, or at least connect and share the information that you have about your situation, because, it's important that all of those individuals are counted and are part of whatever model is being developed. And it's interesting because, I mean, this is a period where we're now people are now understanding the concept of modeling more because of COVID. And I think, it's important to then, leverage that in a way to show them that, look, we also have to model the way that we're going to get resources on the other side of this, or the way we're going to make the ask resources on the other side of this, and you have to be a part of that.
Yeah. We have one final question, which I think is the bridge to most of the rest of the day, which is about what should we do in community to advocate for emergency funds. We mentioned the Venue Association. How do we let emergency funds build if another situation like this happens, and especially as it might return? We're going to have lots of groups today talking about representation into government and policy, but any sort of closing thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's just that is the question. That is the right question. And I think a lot of us, and I appreciate, Gigi, that folks are going to be joining later, but people like Kate Becker from King County, we need to be able to pivot into a hyper-pragmatic sort of sense of what does reopening look like and what is missing from our networks, missing from our areas of expertise, what kind of funding is necessary to do things like sanitation. I mean, we have to get very granular about what is this going to look like and how are we communicating to audiences, so audiences feel like and music workers feel like they're partners in this. We have to feel like we're really doing this right. And it's unfortunately, kind of uncharted. Well, obviously this is all uncharted territory, but I think that we're excited at Music Cities Together that we've been sort of under the hood with some concepts about how to maybe do some pilot work that might be some ways of showcasing how do you develop some sort of models and some protocols that could hopefully inspire some other communities. But I think that is exactly the right question. And if we don't, if we don't do that work collectively, with the flare-ups and with the cycles that we can all anticipate, it's just not going to work. So we have to, get on the front end of this, or else we're in a lot of trouble.
So, and I'll just want to answer the question as far as how to advocate. I mean, from being an advocate, starting out, data is the language of policy. From working in city government, I think that's one of the main reasons why we offered these communities this free survey tool, whether if they do it or if they copy it, they were getting all the information. So I think the best way to advocate in your community is to get data, because that's what the policymakers want to hear to move the needle.